Let's talk about what might be coming down the pipeline as far as RFK Jr.'s new dietary guidelines. My name is Dr. Ruth Otten. I'm a board certified adult psychiatrist and a metabolic psychiatrist, which means that I look at the overlap between mental health and metabolic health. And we know that your diet is hugely important for your mental health and all of the chemical processes that your brain needs to do in order to function and thrive. So these dietary guidelines matter. So for reference, the latest dietary guidelines came out in fall of 2024, shortly after the election of Donald Trump. And these weren't too different from past dietary guidelines, but there was more of an emphasis on increasing your protein from plant-based sources and decreasing your intake of animal products. Now, I expect that these new guidelines from RFK Jr. may be turning those things on their head. So let's talk about a few of the changes that we anticipate. So first, red meat and saturated fat is probably going to get another look. So we know that RFK Jr., he describes himself as a carnivore, and there has been a lot of controversy over the research that's involved related to whether or not saturated fat and red meat are actually causative of metabolic issues like high cholesterol, diabetes, etc., or if those studies just showed a correlation and were poorly done. So it's really hard to say. You can basically find a study to support whatever you think is right. Another thing that we're probably going to see is a movement away from using reduced fat dairy products and towards using whole fat dairy products. So whole milk yogurt, whole milk cottage cheese, full fat cheese, etc. So there's a lot of talk about revisiting that relationship between full fat dairy and, again, cardiometabolic risk factors, things like high cholesterol, cardiovascular disease, stroke. Another change is probably that there's going to be less of an emphasis on getting your protein from plant-based sources, things like beans and legumes. We anticipate that the new guidelines are likely to emphasize getting your proteins from animal sources, which are complete proteins, meaning that you don't need to mix different sources to get all of the essential amino acids, aka the amino acids that you're not able to produce yourself, as opposed to plant-based sources where most of them don't have complete protein and you need to mix and match in order to get all of the amino acids that you need. Next, we definitely know that ultra-processed food is going to take a hit. RFK Jr. has been outspoken about his feelings about ultra-processed foods, meaning things that are high in refined sugars and carbohydrates and seed oils. And part of this will be coming up with a government-wide definition of what an ultra-processed food is, because we don't really have that. And then subsequently making clear dietary guidelines about what foods should be avoided or shouldn't be avoided and what amounts. And then lastly is the big question mark of alcohol. We know that increasing data that has been coming out has been showing the risks of alcohol, association with cancer, stroke, and premature death. But at the same time, the Trump administration has been kind of quiet on its approach towards alcohol. The current guidelines are no more than 2 drinks a day for men, 14 per week, and 1 drink a day for women, or 7 per week. And as far as binge drinking, no more than 3 drinks at a time for men and no more than 2 at a time for women. However, research that's coming out is showing that even that amount of alcohol intake can be associated with increased risk. Not to say that there's no safe amount of alcohol, but in general, we're seeing that the lower intake, the better. So what do I think about all these guidelines as a metabolic psychiatrist? I think that I agree with the root of most of them, that ultra-processed foods are terrible for our mental health, that animal-based proteins are probably the better source of proteins for our body. I'm all about full fat dairy. And I think that if you're eating meat and other animal sources of saturated fat that are in the context of a whole food diet, I don't have any problem with that. But I say all that with the caveat that trying to make a guideline that outlines the ideal diet for everyone does not take into account each individual situation. So it doesn't take into account their medical comorbidities or their cultural or ethnic cuisine, or maybe their moral standing on certain things. If someone is a vegan or vegetarian because they feel that it is unethical to consume animal products, then it's not right to force that upon them. And of course, the individual does not have to follow these guidelines. They can make their own decisions and eat what they want. However, these guidelines do become essentially the rule for a lot of federally based programs. So these guidelines are going to affect what prisoners get when they're incarcerated, what kids get when they're on free and reduced meal plans, and what foods people have access to who need food stamps or WIC. So it's definitely going to impact the lives of people. My hope is that there will be movement toward making healthier whole food options more accessible and available to the general public by decreasing subsidies on ultra-processed foods and replacing those subsidies on foods that have more nutritional value. But as we all know, there are so many different competing factors when it comes to politics. So time will tell. What about you? What are your thoughts about these potential dietary guideline changes, and would they change how you eat? Wish you all good mental health today, and I'll see you in the next.